The latest ArtNet Intelligence Report is out, and now we're taking it live. On April 8, Editor-in-Chief Naomi Ray joins award-winning senior reporter Katya Kazakina for a virtual conversation unpacking the report's key findings. Tap the link in the show notes to reserve your spot. Leonardo is the brain. His work is very heady, obviously. Michelangelo is the heart. His work is very emotional and dramatic. And Raphael, I think it's fair to say, is the face. I mean, he is Mr. Suave.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Raphael is one of those names that everyone knows. He's the Prince of Painters, a master of the High Renaissance, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has given him the full blockbuster treatment. Their highly anticipated exhibition, called Raphael Sublime Poetry, opened in March and is on view until this June. The show is the first comprehensive international loan exhibition ever dedicated to him in the United States, and there are 237 works of art in total, 33 paintings, 142 drawings, and his Sistine Chapel tapestries. There's loans from the Louvre, the Vatican Museum, the Prado, the Uffizi, and the British Museum. And many of these works, according to the Met, have never been shown together, and some have never previously left Europe. It took 17 years to assemble this show. So no one quite captured divine beauty like Raphael did, but what is the story within the story of this artist who left such an indelible mark on Western art? I'm joined by art critic and podcast co-host Ben Davis, who's just published a review of the exhibition to dive into this question. Hey, Ben.
Hello, Kate. Very excited to talk to you about Raphael Sublime Poetry.
Yeah, me too. So, as I mentioned, this was a highly, highly anticipated exhibition, and it's finally here. Can you describe what people are walking into and give us a little whistle-stop tour throughout the exhibition?
I think you gave a fine idea of the scope of the show. It is 170 works. Most of them are drawings. So it's 33 paintings, I think, and some tapestries that are quite fun. And it roughly tells the story of his life. It starts with his early years and actually works by his father and goes through works by his master, his first teacher, Perugino, and then walks you through early works, gives you some pages by Leonardo and Michelangelo to show what else was going on during the Renaissance in his time. He was the younger artist, the artist on the come up during this time. And then it is a tour of greatest hits. There's the Alba Madonna from the National Gallery of Art, which is a very beautiful Madonna and Child with baby John the Baptist. And there is a work that a lot of people, including myself, seem stopped by in the show is Portrait of a Young Woman with Unicorn from 1505, which is this little portrait of a young woman who is dressed in fine clothes with a ruby and pearl pendant, and she's holding this scruffy little unicorn in her lap. This is a marriage portrait to basically advertise her as a potential bride.
Wow.
And then it goes on and on and on and concludes with his works in Rome. He's Mr. Rome, very much where he did the bulk of his work, and ends with works that tip over into a new kind of style, more Mannerist and less high Renaissance. Lots of stuff I didn't know there. There's a long vertical tapestry that recreates a work of his called St. Paul in Prison, where it depicts a praying St. Paul who's using his divine powers to summon an earthquake. And it has this decorative border. And at the bottom, there's a personification of the earthquake, which is this kind of superhero strongman bursting out of the ground. And he bursts through the decorative border at the edge. And it really looks like it could be a Jack Kirby comic book painting from the 1960s. So gives you the full breadth of Raphael. Pretty amazing to see in person.
Yeah, his work, it's so divine and perfect almost. And, I think it's perhaps, I'm curious what you think of this, but you mentioned in your review that the Met introduces him as one of the greatest influencers of all time. And I wonder what your reaction is to that. Like, what is going on with this framing?
Yeah, the very first line of the Met's introductory text, the show says he is one of the greatest influences of all time. I don't know. It's a bizarre framing to me. There's also, I should say, something like an immersive Raphael room where some of his famous murals that cannot travel from Rome are featured, like the School of Athens, perhaps the most famous and liked Raphael work. It's funny, you say that he is hard to argue with, or I think they are beautiful. An interesting thing about Raphael is that in his time, he was the guy. As you said, he was the Prince of Painters. He was the most famous Renaissance artist in his day. And for ages and ages and ages and ages afterwards, he was considered the height of excellence. In the 1900s, he sort of became associated with the academic style that people were more rebelling against. Famously, the pre-Raphaelites wanted to go back to before Raphael. Art felt more direct. Something about the level of polish and sweetness that he is known for and that he perfected became a little bit icky to people and seemed a little bit sentimental. His Madonna and Child paintings became associated with religious kitsch in a way. So I think the show is hard to argue with, but on the other hand, it is trying to find a contemporary story for him that reanimates these works. And I mean, I don't think the audience today really is that much invested in those debates. I think you essentially get the idea of Raphael just as like a name you know from the Renaissance, and people are just here to see quote unquote Renaissance art. It's great art, but nevertheless, I think he is not a painter of great emotional expressivity. I do not think. He is a painter of great control and discipline and refinement and harmony. And, you know, for us living after the Romantics, our idea of art is very much about emotional expressivity and drama in a way that is in there, but it fits a little bit in an odd way with the legend of Raphael. I think we'll get into that.
Yeah. So before we get into also his stardom and the depths and heights of his career, so this is the Renaissance time. He was born in 1483, dies in 1520. Can you just say shortly, like, what was the sort of origin story of Raphael? Where did he come from?
Yeah, he came from Umbria, which is not Florence, but it has its own artistic scene going on. He gets famous young. This show begins with his pencil self-portrait of himself where he really looks like a hungry young man with like long hair, and he's gazing out at you with a sense of confidence. He becomes a master artist, meaning that he can run his own workshop at 17. And then you just see him very quickly learning the styles of his time, like very hungrily trying to learn the best of what art had to offer in that period. The show makes a lot of his study of Leonardo. There were all these innovations coming out of Leonardo's work that had to do with different kinds of perspective, aerial perspective, being able to depict distances by modulating the colors, and form, being able to use different kinds of shade in order to suggest the substance of a body, and movement. There's a lot of, in terms of how figures twist and in relationship to each other to give a sense of drama, and psychology. So Leonardo very famously kind of invents this idea that you express the inner life of the characters through their outer relationships with each other. You see that really famously in The Last Supper, where every character is relating to another character. And there's kind of this movement of psychology that passes through the figures as they look at each other around the canvas. And you see Raphael assimilate that into his works, where you have these configurations of characters who all have some sort of expressive relationship to the other characters in the canvas, or a lot of these actually aren't canvases. It's before the invention of canvas painting. They're panel paintings, a lot of them. And then what I think is very interesting is that when he goes to Rome, he spends a few years in Florence from 1504 to 1508, where he doesn't have a lot of success. Like, he goes there as a student of the masters and as an ambitious guy to make his name. and he just can't break in. But then his countryman, or his paisano, Bramante, the Pope's architect, is also from his region, Umbria, and brings him in as the hot new thing to Rome. And he really makes his name doing these frescoes for the papal apartments. And in the early 1500s, he very quickly becomes an artist of almost unprecedented success. Like, it was not unusual to work in a workshop. I mean, he got his start in Perugino's workshop, but he is like employing dozens and dozens and dozens of artists working for him and just turning it out, like doing all kinds of things. He also becomes in charge of all the archaeological projects in Rome. And then he gets tapped when Bramante dies to be in charge of the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. So he is just doing a ton. Like, he's in so much demand. Actually, it's funny. Although it was not unusual to work with assistants, Michelangelo, who was his rival at the time, he's also working in Rome doing the Sistine Chapel and so on, kind of sniffed at this. You know, he thought it was pretty vulgar. Michelangelo, who guarded his creative independence very jealously, basically thought this guy was kind of corporate.
Interesting. So this sort of reminds me of like the sort of Fordian like artist studios that we have today in some ways. Was he kind of one of the first to do this at such a scale so rapidly?
Well, at that scale, yeah. I mean, and at this time, this was awe-inspiring to people. Just a representation of his power. It's an interesting thing that this show doesn't really go into, but fascinates me. As I said, he was considered the greatest artist of his age. When he died, it was a huge to-do. He was buried at the Pantheon, and he became the model for artists for years and years and years, centuries afterwards. But a thing happens in the 19th century when the Romantic period gives us the idea of the independent artist as the most important thing. Because you see, in the industrial age, what becomes really important about art is the individual artist, the individual vision. And that wasn't really how Raphael was working. So in addition to seeming a little over-refined to people in that time, where people liked a more stormy, romantic energy, there is something about that corporate way of production that sat a little bit strangely with people. And if you read the early theories of connoisseurship in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they're trying to work out modern theories of authenticating art and stuff, Raphael's like a really interesting case because he's undeniably one of the major artists of all time, like the model for all these important artists. But he also undeniably did not work in this specifically autographic way where everything that was good about the work came from the hand of the master. So a lot of modern theories of connoisseurship use him as an object where they're working out, how do you tell what is Raphael and what is workshop of Raphael? Like, what really is the signature of that he's in the mix himself personally? And then in this show, you see a little bit of that in the sense that his assistants, the people who he worked with, there's a bunch of works by them, and there's some works that are co-authored between him and them. And in some cases, it's still not clear who did what. And you go through the catalog, and there are a lot of like really fine-grained scholarly debates about what parts of what are by who, and so on.
So you mentioned Leonardo and Michelangelo. The Met actually had a show of Leonardo's work in 2003, Michelangelo in 2017, and now there's Raphael. And as you said, these three painters knew each other, and they obviously had opinions about each other, as you've touched on. What was Raphael doing that was really distinct from these two other artists? Because, you know, if you kind of blur your eyes, they're painting similar scenes, but there's key differences between what each of them were doing.
Oh, sure. Well, everybody was painting similar scenes. I mean, it's easy to overlook. I mean, we just almost don't think about it, but the personal content of these works is limited. They are all doing standard themes. Now, each of them invents their own variations on things, and in some cases creates new types. Like the Mona Lisa invents a certain type of portrait pose. And then in this show, you see Raphael pick it up and synthesize it, do his own version of it. The way you might sum it up, I think this is intuitive to most people, is that Leonardo is the brain. His work is very heady, obviously. Michelangelo is the heart. His work is very emotional and dramatic. And Raphael, I think it's fair to say, is the face. I mean, he is Mr. Suave. His work is very graceful. He's a very dexterous artist. He does a lot of things. He's working in a lot of different styles, and he's very good at taking a certain style and putting it at the disposal of his patrons for whatever they want to do and coming up with new, fresh ways to do it. But his main thing is grace and harmony and really perfecting this beautiful style that really becomes the standard of beauty going forward, the standard of what beautiful art looks like.
And in particular, feminine beauty, right? Leonardo and Michelangelo were not painting women in quite the way that Raphael was.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I mean, both biographically, one thing we know about both Leonardo and Michelangelo is that they preferred men romantically. And Raphael really preferred women. He is one of art history's ladies' men. And that's part of his legend. And it shows in their art. I mean, the main memorable scenes in Michelangelo are mainly male nudes. I mean, if you look at the Sistine Chapel and the birth of Adam, with Adam touching fingers with God and his beautiful form, and you look over and see Eve off to the side looking on, she really looks like she's not invited to the party. Raphael, meanwhile, he really specializes in female beauty and the female form more than they do, particularly in the Madonnas, of course, which draws on stuff Leonardo was doing, but creates, it's really his signature, is the Madonna and Child. But the Met doesn't do a lot with this, but Vasari, his biographer, who sort of invents art history on top of the achievements of these figures in the Renaissance, he makes a lot of Raphael's sex life. It really becomes part of his legend. I'll read you some of the passages. He says, Raphael was very amorous and fond of women and was continually pressed into their service. He was always indulging his sexual appetites, and on this his friends were probably more indulgent and tolerant than they should have been. And
wow.
So on and
Well,
so forth.
value judgment there.
Yeah. Raphael died young, relatively, at 37. And part of that legend, too, is sort of a rock star death. The way Vasari put it, he said, Raphael kept up his secret love affairs and pursued his pleasures with no sense of moderation. And on one occasion, he went to excess and returned home with a violent fever. And then he goes on to say that Raphael was too ashamed to say why he was sick, and the doctor misdiagnosed him and bled him, and then he fell sick and passed away.
On Good Friday, nonetheless, too.
On his birthday. A poet's death.
Indeed. We'll come back to that in a bit, but, I think we've started to sort of build this picture of this guy. And another thing that I think is really important to kind of understanding the essence of Raphael is something that you bring up in your review, this studied nonchalance. There's an Italian term for it. And an acquaintance of his, Baldassare Castiglione, has sort of come up with this. And he's, I think, a subject of one of Raphael's paintings, right?
Yeah. In this show, very near to the portrait of a young woman with unicorn, it's another portrait, his portrait of Baldassare Castiglione, who was a buddy of Raphael's, and he wrote a book called The Book of the Courier, which was an advice guide for young men in courtly circles about how to behave. And he coined this term sprezzatura, which means a nonchalance. The ideal of behavior was to, in all things, be stylish without seeming to be stylish. Actually, there's a quote from him you can read in the catalog where he talks specifically about how men should wear black. They should wear dark colors. That's the ideal. You want to show off, but you want to be serious. It sounds very much like a New York gallery opening. And his portrait of Castiglione has him dressed all in these black velvets and furs, very fine clothes, and against a black background. So embodying what he preached. And I think it's fair to say that that value of controlled elegance is something that also flows throughout Raphael's work.
Yeah, just almost like hipster artists of his time or something, right? Like this idea of quiet luxury
It's a
and
bit quiet luxury, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you describe him also as this kind of archetype of a rock star. You've mentioned that he's got dozens of assistants, all these commissions. He's a very busy artist. But what do you mean by a rock star artist? Like, is he a party boy? Like, what's going on here? You kind of touched on it. I guess he died.
Well, I should say, this is very much part of his legend, particularly as it's passed to us through Vasari. I think the Met is downplaying that for reasons of keeping things serious. They say in the material around the show that he probably just died of overwork because he was working a lot. However, it's worth saying he does live a rock star life. I would even say that like Vasari's life of Raphael kind of originates this particular story we tell about artists that you see in every artist biopic where they have like great creative success and then that becomes excess. So he goes to Rome, he becomes the Pope's favorite, and he is living the high life. When people call him the Prince of Painters, it's because he made incredible art, but it's also because he lived like a prince. There's a great letter in the catalog from one of his uncles who writes him in 1514, basically saying, look, you're past 30. Don't you think it's time you got married? You're at risk of bringing dishonor on the family, Raphael. And Raphael writes back, I have property in Rome amounting to 3,000 ducats in gold. And now, as a start, I have 50 ducats in gold because His Holiness has given me to oversee the Fabrica di San Pietro with a stipend of 300 ducats in gold, which I will not lack for as long as I live. And I am sure that I will receive other monies. Furthermore, I am paid for my work however much I wish. I have begun to paint another room for His Holiness, which will amount to 1,000 ducats in gold. So, my dearest uncle, I make you and all the relatives proud, as well as our fatherland. He's really like proud of like how much money he's making. He buys a palace, the Palazzo Caprini, which you see drawings of in this show. And as I said, he has a reputation as a womanizer. He does get engaged, but he clearly does not really want to get engaged and is drawing it out.
And there's a work in the show, right, of his mistress. What can you say about this painting and what does it tell us about his life?
So again, it's interesting what the Met does and does not say here, because there is a very famous painting in the show, again in the portraits section, called Portrait of the Nude for Narina from around 1520. That's the year of his death. And it is thought to be Margherita Luti, which is his most famous mistress. And she is topless in the piece. She's wearing this negligee or a veil, like a very diaphanous garment. And she has one hand to one breast and the other in her lap, which this is a conventional modest Venus pose. And the background is all this vegetation, which is all various symbols of Venus, the goddess of love. She is also wearing an armband that has his name on it. So this painting has inspired lots of people's imagination. I mean, oh my God, it's so embarrassing. I was reading this review of another Raphael show from a quarter century ago in the Times, and they had like this French curator talking about the painting and saying like, you look at the painting and you think they've just made love or they're about to make love. Like that's what it gives off. And the Met doesn't really go deeply into this, and there's lots of speculation about what this painting meant or means or what their relationship was. But it is very important to the mythology of Raphael, this figure. She was, in the 19th century, considered the model of models in terms of the imagination of artists in the Romantic period, early Romantic period, about the lifestyle of the artist. Like this relationship between the two of them is really important. I mean, part of the death of Raphael's mythology is that he died after a night where he partied too hard with her. Like they had too much sex and he died. That's a very standard part of the mythology. And tons of artists make paintings of Raphael and Margherita Luti. Ang makes one, Turner makes one, Balzac writes about them, Baudelaire writes about them. So this idea of Raphael as this representation of the sexual prowess of the male artist is like a huge part of his story. Not something that gets a lot of play here, but something I find interesting for various reasons.
It's interesting that he and we'll get into this in a bit, but just painting these idealized figures of immaculate beauty and then being kind of this heathen with the profits of that is just something.
Oh, well, one thing I wanted to say about her that I find interesting is that his Madonnas are blonde. You know, it is an unreal beauty. It is not typical of Italy. It is a poetic ideal, but his Madonnas are blonde because they're supposed to be like magical. Whereas this portrait of La Fornarina, which means a baker's daughter, by the way, because she's supposed to have been the daughter of a baker, or it's possible it's slang for a sex worker too. But she is dark-haired and, you know, it really looks like a slightly more specific likeness than some of his Madonnas.
Interesting. Yeah, you know, you write in your review that his short life, like as you said, he became famous at 20 and dies at, I think, 37. You can see the entire arc of this beauty ideal as it kind of emerges in the High Renaissance, gets perfected arguably by Raphael, and then you write, it turns into something else. So what does that kind of hitting of the ceiling look like in the show? And can you kind of detect a moment through the works where the ideal is giving way to something new?
Well, I don't know if you can set a specific moment in the show. I mean, the show ends with works, as I said, that become more mannerist or make an opening towards mannerism, which...
What does that look like?
So the High Renaissance stuff, which he perfects, you know, is this harmonious sense of emotion expressed but controlled. That's Sprezzatura idea. And of action captured at its point of psychological tension, but not overflowing. And the taste of the later Renaissance, which is kind of reacting against that sense, is much more extreme. It becomes, first in mannerism, and then later, in the Counter-Reformation period, you get the Baroque, which is all about this kind of muscular assertion of almost like a propaganda of the emotions and feelings, like trying to overwhelm you with feelings. And definitely not the intellect and the emotions in balance the way you get in something like the School of Athens. So you get a work here, like it's a very small work, but a very excellent work called The Vision of Ezekiel from 1516. And it has at the bottom just a very tiny landscape with the prophet Ezekiel, just as a tiny, like barely a speck of a figure. In the center is this like overwhelming vision bursting out of the clouds with like the beasts from Revelation, like in a frenzy. And it just is a much more intense and wild style and becomes a model for artists looking for a way beyond what Raphael himself had perfected. And then it's just interesting. You should not do psychological readings of Raphael's style, I do not think, because he is not there to express himself. He is there to do a task. He is the consummate professional. It is interesting, though. Something changes in this period, the 1520 end of his life, in the emotional tonalities of the Renaissance. And some scholars think that it has to do with some of the same forces that gave us the Reformation. You know, that there is a sense of strain within this world, like the sense of confident harmony that Raphael perfects at an earlier time. There's a kind of a sense of a little bit of intensity within that goes beyond that I think could reflect, you know, you could definitely project into it a sense that this world is kind of a little bit overripe. And there are like cracks forming beneath the surface.
Yeah, so there's this sort of sense that something is peaking. And you mentioned in your review the Sistine tapestries, which are in the exhibition, the physical climax of the show. And you connect them to what you were just mentioning, this wider kind of shift that's happening in society at the time. Could you speak about Leo X, who had a big role to play in the creation of these works, but also the Reformation that was to come?
Oh, yeah. So this is kind of the focus of my article. It's not exactly something you get in the show. These tapestries, the Sistine tapestries, Leo X commissioned them from Raphael's art firm, and they're meant to be hung for special occasions in the Sistine Chapel. So they're meant to compete with Michelangelo, and were very important in that sense. They're like state of the art. You have to send them away to get them made. You have to make the design and you send it away to Brussels to get them made. They became like the symbol of the peak of luxury. The versions here are from the King of Spain's collection because they became very desirable to have a tapestry of this kind.
And the man commissioning them, Leo X, just to paint a picture of him, he's a Medici. So this is like what's going on too, right?
Yes. I mean, that's very important to me because I think that Raphael inherits this kind of Renaissance mission for art that the Medicis bring. And yes, Leo X is a Medici pope, born Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So comes to court and brings the Medici lifestyle with him. And when I talked about Raphael's lavish lifestyle, that was a side effect of, among other things, this Pope spending freely on art because it was part of his Medici background, and just also was a tremendously free-living Pope. You know, he loved to hunt with like huge entourages, and he loved masquerades and balls, and he kept a pet elephant named Hanno that Raphael does draw and does make art about, and is not in the show. So his art patronage and Raphael's success is part of this whole frenzy of decadence that overcomes Rome in this time period.
And Raphael was born the same year as Martin Luther, so that's 1483. And you call this connection not a coincidence. So how can we sit with that? Can you walk us through the chain of, you've got these Sistine tapestries commissioned by Leo X, and then you've got the Martin Luther knocking his 95 Theses on the church doors.
Yeah. Well, and that year, the year that Martin Luther nails up the 95 Theses, kicking off the Protestant Reformation, is basically Raphael's peak of productivity. It's when the most commissions are coming into him. He is born the same year as Martin Luther. There is like this parallel between the two, or their lives tell you something about one another. I mean, Martin Luther comes to Rome in 1510 and is appalled by the worldly excess there. This is right when Raphael is working on the papal apartments. So these two stories are connected. I think I first read about this in Gombrich's The Story of Art. He mentions the fact that when Bramante dies, the Pope puts Raphael in charge of the St. Peter's Basilica project, and Raphael takes on the architectural commission. And because he's such a free-spending Pope on things including these tapestries that are here, which the Met remarks in just a single line, contributed to the bankruptcy of Leo's papacy, he has to find some means to fund this very important symbolic project of St. Peter's Basilica. And one of the solutions he hits upon is to sell indulgences in Germany, which means that in return for giving the church gold and filling Leo's coffers, you can have a freebie on some of your sins, which is just a total symbol of the worldly corruption of the church that had so concerned Martin Luther. So I just think this is a really interesting story, and I'm just surprised more isn't made of it in the art history I have learned, that the greatest achievements of the High Renaissance, it's like indisputable. I mean, this show is absolutely extraordinary and once in a lifetime event. You should go see it. Coincides with, this moment of decadence that like splits Europe in two and leads to decades of political strife and power struggles and wars, and completely reshapes and in some senses gives birth to the modern world through its turbulence. So I just think that's an extraordinary story to take with from the show. And I think that people want to kind of defend the art from it. The way I've read about this story told is basically to try and disconnect the two, to basically be like, well, the good side of Leo X was that he was a Medici Pope and he funded art. And the bad side was that his excesses led to the Reformation. But they really are the same story. And I think in terms of finding a contemporary Raphael, a Raphael for today, that makes the art more haunting to me. It asks some questions or asks some it opens a conversation to me that feels like a way into a whole conversation about culture and what the price of beauty is, how truly indisputably pleasurable, desirable, good, excellent things can be claimed by the wrong people and the prices of that. So I think it's something to be steered into, not away from, is what I'm saying. And that's kind of what I try to do in my article.
Yeah, and that feels like it's got some parallels to this present moment in today's world. Like it feels like there could be some real lessons here, perhaps, dare I say.
Look, the Medicis did this more than once. People still say you're a modern Medici. And what they just mean by that is almost always, you're a great patron of the arts. You're a rich person who has great taste in supporting the right people. We should really think a little bit more deeply about this because the Medicis did this more than once. That's the crazy thing, Kate, is that the Medici patronage in Florence was so autocratic that they touched off an entire revolt by Savonarola. He was this fire-breathing preacher, and the autocratic politics of the Medici got rolled together with his support of beauty in terms of a language of decadence. And that had a big popular public. We think of the art of the Renaissance as indisputably, like a value above all things. But in its time, Botticelli himself converted to Savonarola's doctrine, and a lot of his artwork was burned in the bonfire of the vanities. And Leo X knew all this because he only became Pope after he helped reassert Medici authority over Florence. And then he becomes Pope and he does the whole thing again on a much higher level. The spiral just expands where the patronage of arts expands and expands and expands. It's like he's an all-time patron. I mean, very few figures in history have been as responsible for as much truly epically great art as Pope Leo X. But then he pushes it so far that the exact same thing happens with the Protestant Reformation on a much, even more world-defining scale that completely changes all of Europe and not just the Italian peninsula. So there's a lot to think about there. I don't think it takes us away from the art. I think that it connects us more deeply with it to let it ask those questions of us.
Well, this has been great, Ben. Thank you so much for all of this fascinating history, some of which woefully maybe undertold in this Met show, but it nevertheless seems like an exceptional exhibition.
Yeah, go see the show and then read about it, and there's plenty to talk about, bottomless amount of things to think about in this show.
It's been a pleasure to have you on, as always.
Absolute pleasure. I could talk about this all day.
The Art Enclo is produced by Sonia Menely with contributions from myself, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.